Oops. All right. Okay, Justin, we're good? Check. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Everybody can hear it? Oops. Okay, I think this has always been my nemesis. All right, we'll get everybody to grab a seat and we will get rolling here. So, my name is Cam, for those who do not know me or have never met me before. Why am I here? Well, I'm here probably for the same reasons you're here, is just to gain some more clarity, just speak about what's going on in our times, and more importantly, understand what we can do in those times. You know, what kind of role can we play, and how can we be equipped to approach other people, because it's really important that we were able to engage other people who are on the other side of this with us or don't see it the same way, and how can we come at this a different way. So tonight what I'm going to talk to you about, is that still, trying to get this lower here without that. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is how I would go about destroying a nation step by step, and what things would I do. So I'll start with a quote from Aristotle. Aristotle said, "Courage is the first virtue, and it is the virtue above all things." And these days when we look around, we wonder often, where is the courage? Where are all the courageous people? And Patton, who was a general during World War II, said, "Moral courage is the most important but absent in man." That moral courage is very hard for people, and it's not something that is as common for men and women to have, and we see that certainly these days. But again, how did we get here, and what were the events that did this? So let's begin. So if I was going to destroy a nation step by step, I would attack it from different fronts. I would have a coordinated attack. I would first pick a nation that was powerful, one that would have a lot of resources. So for example, I would take a nation like the US or Canada, somewhere that's resource rich. I would time my attack during a time of peak prosperity. Now, a lot of people would think, well, you know, prosperity is not always the best time, but it is, because people are asleep at the wheel. When we're prosperous, we're comfortable. Okay? It's maybe not a pretty analogy, but think of it like pigs to the slaughter. People are fat, they're ready, they're just comfortable, complacent. And that's what we are in the West, especially in North America, where we've had so much privilege. And we are enjoying all of that due to all the predecessors who came before us and paid a dear price for that freedom that we enjoy. I would attack the foundations of that country, and I would drive the fathers from the home. You know what, I'm going to switch this, Justin, so this thing's very staticky. So hang on, I'm just going to go to the old-fashioned mic, just 1 minute. All right, okay. So I would drive fathers from the home, which would help destroy the family unit, which is the foundation of society. We know that society, especially Western societies, and societies throughout the world, are built on a family unit. And if I can drive the fathers away, if I can break that home up, I have much better access to making inroads. I would offer financial heroin to the citizens, with big government being their dealer. So I would get everybody on every program I could. I would want to have them dependent on me. So I would become ultimately their parent. I would be able to run their lives. I would erode the inner cities, places like Vancouver, Victoria, New York, LA, and ensure that there's no escape to the suburbs. Basically, I would want every part of the country to look like every other part, so there was nowhere to go. I would eliminate role models for others, and that they would have no one to emulate. There's no heroes left. And that I would ensure that everyone is dependent on big government. I would feed their fears, and I would starve their dreams and aspirations. Promise them wealth without work and effort, prosperity without perseverance. I would offer them success without any kind of sacrifice, and I know they would line up to buy it, because there's no work involved. I would build a compliant and reliable voting bloc, which I would feed with endless tax dollars siphoned from the working class, the middle class. I would enslave them to handouts and justify that they deserve them due to their current situation. After all, they are victims due to their skin color, their gender, you name it, fill it in. We're going to make victims out of everybody. I would keep everybody focused on their differences, their gender, their skin color, again, fill in the blanks. We would not focus on character, and above all, we would remove any and all personal responsibility for one's actions. In other words, we would manufacture victims and oppressors. That's a society we live in now. Everybody's either a victim or they're an oppressor. If you're white, for example, you are automatically an oppressor. You've oppressed, you've stolen, you've looted everybody else. I would manufacture victims entrenched believing their right to rebel and equip them with the means and direction to execute their rebellion. I would give them a belief that they have every right to demand what they're demanding. They've been hard done by. Okay? I would infiltrate the churches and replace God with government. I would threaten non-compliant pastors who oppose the narrative with threat of closure and loss of their tax exemption status. I would support and pick churches and pastors who cherry pick and take the Bible out of context in order to promote whatever the culture is wanting to push. I would strive to undermine the relevance of any type of church, and more importantly, God, by subtle suppression of the churches. Never all at once, but I would gradually turn up the water to boiling before anybody would notice. So, once you've managed to drive fathers out of the home, God from the church, and marketplace of ideas, and captivated the nation with culture streaming at them 24/7, you will have ensured courage is in short supply, at which point you can ramp up the focus and dependence on Big Brother, aka Big Government. Concurrently, you need to infiltrate the big business and corporations that make a nation work. You need to do this at all levels, executive to clerical. You need to pay particular attention to those focused on providing intelligence, healthcare policies, and information technology to the leaders of the nation. This would allow for self-destructive politics and policies to flourish in the name of cultural normalcy and eradicate any dissent by effectively muting, canceling, and ignoring actual truth. You would infiltrate corporate empires such as Disney, which were once built by faith, freedom, and virtue system, systematically by infiltrating their boards and leadership positions, and see their corporate culture with your agenda of destruction and deception. You would ensure that this new entity would at all times have a marquee virtue signal, while real virtue would be replaced with an insidious vice. So you would do this, like I said, at all levels. You would capture big medicine, mainstream media, and big tech all the same way. You would provide a platform for tracking bodies and controlling minds, while at the same time whitewashing any real truth or dissent. You would infiltrate the medical boards, the journals, and you would have control of the oversight of research. You would do this by passing laws that would allow pharmaceutical companies unfettered power, effectively allowing them to capture major medical oversight agencies by providing them a large portion of their funding. They would become dependent on the same companies they are supposed to be policing. You would promote profit over health and propaganda over science by controlling the narrative of to follow the science that you created and control. Find a medical problem or create a plague that you could push a false narrative simultaneously with an irresponsible and dangerous patient management scheme, all the while driving fear and isolation in the masses, resulting in mass hysteria. You would drain the government coffers to help those in need with the aforementioned need that you created, while at the same time enriching corporations that supply the plan, while at the same time crushing small businesses that compete with them now or would do so in the future. You would have no issue with governments having trillions of dollars or billions of dollars of debt. This would be the greatest transfer of wealth from the middle class to the ruling class. As freedoms are sacrificed in the name of health care, you would ride the fear narrative to create a form of voting. We had that in the last election, a lot of mail-in voting that happened especially in the US, that would ensure that the readily controlled leaders that you preferred were reelected. You would pay people not to work and destroy the greatest competition to your beliefs, the middle class. Of course, you would only be assured of success in remaking the nation if you had a spineless and controlled opposition party. You would need men and women without virtue and honor, folks who are guided by career interests and self-preservation. This would make them ready targets for your control. Folks whose personal ambitions could only be outdone by their wanton cowardice. If I were doing it, I would thoroughly capture the culture and sow the future with deception, leading to destruction. I would work to eliminate as many children prior to birth as possible, then corrupt and manipulate the ones that escape my plan with the use of the public school system. I would use authority figures, trusted teachers, to push immorality and remove moral consciousness, all in the name of social consciousness. I would promote and support financially unvirtuous leaders who would further divide the citizens of the nation along their differences, physical ones such as race and gender, instead of uniting them on common goals and objectives. I would keep these folks in office by changing, modifying, attacking, or eliminating laws that would put limits on their power. Just look at the PMO's office today. Unlimited, unfettered power. So when we just talk about the fact of kids and what happens in kids, there's probably not a lot of people that realize that between our K-12 system in BC, we have about 545,000 kids who go through that system. Okay? That is roughly 15.5% of the voting bloc. So every so many years, we cycle through that many kids. And that's how you control more and more. And that's why the kids are a great target for these people who would have this type of agenda. I would welcome protests that support my ideals and safeguard my protesters from punishment. How many people remember the Black Lives Matter protests that happened during COVID when everybody else was locked down? Seemed like there was no issue, there was no mass spreading of anything at that time. While punish any peaceful protests against my narrative. We've seen those. Ottawa. Okay. I would make examples out of virtuous and brave folks. We can cite doctors in our province who are singled out by creating narratives out of thin air to destroy their lives and career. I would promote cancel culture, thereby sowing fears into the ranks of all peaceful dissenters. I would silence and quash all good information in the name of misinformation. And now we know that the U.S. has set up a new agency, a new governance board, to mandate and watch over misinformation. I would silence and quash, I would attack virtuous and courageous folks, and I would promote deceitful and cunning liars and grifters. I would stamp out courage, thereby relegating truth to the abyss. I would continue to drive fear in the form of sickness, economic uncertainty, and racial division. But as a solution, I would offer them big government, or me to turn to, instead of God. I would attack the nation's greatest strength, their resources, such as energy, oil, gas, and manufacturing, in the name of green energy. I would destroy the financial and energy independence of the nation. So look at what's happening like in Alberta. We're not producing the oil that we should be. You look at what's happening in the US, even though we could be independent of it, but we're dependent on everything else foreign. So I could redistribute the wealth to a sector that can be controlled with tax dollars, subsidies, allowing for kickbacks to politicians, driving a nation to financial regress. So especially with the New Green Deal, especially in the US, and what we're doing in Canada, I'll give you a quick example. In Europe, we know that with the war that we're having now, or we're not having, but Russia's having with Ukraine, Russia is still selling lots of oil. Germany's buying oil. They're all buying oil. One of the things Russia did, for as much of a failure as Putin is, as much of a madman as they say he is, he was funding a lot of ultra-conservative left-wing environmental groups over the last decade in Europe. He funded them to a large degree so they could promote more new Green Deal type solutions. So all these countries that he's now supplying oil to, they got off of oil. And they're dependent on, guess who now? Because those other things don't work in providing consistent energy. When you have inconsistent energy, you have a nation that is at the mercy of whoever can provide it. You come into this room, when I flick on the switch, I expect the lights to come on. If the lights don't work, I'm going to start worrying. So he was able to do that with a psych ops and convincing these guys to get rid of their basic energy like nuclear, oil, coal, whatever, in lieu of taking solar, wind, and now all of those things are not working for them. I would continue to infiltrate the school administrations, teachers, and school boards, and their unions. I would ensure that I erase the history of the nation, as well as the histories of any other nation that was contrary to my narrative. So look at the examples of statues that come down. People like Sir John A. Macdonald, Christopher Columbus, all these people that are whitewashed or that are now labeled in a whole different place in history. I would untether them from the past and thereby ensuring they possess no roadmap going forward for recovery from the conditions which I manufactured for them. I would rewrite the history, enshrining the generational shame and condemnation, and double down on it as often as I could. Now, of course, once my plan was obvious to those who could recognize it, people who loved their country, I would destroy their minds and their willpower. I would destroy their minds and willpower so that could not be mustered for future generations. I would tell little girls that they were boys and vice versa. I would groom children using trusted educators to influence, corrupt, and ultimately destroy the identities of future generations. I would use the children of those that oppose my ideology to effectively cancel the parents by sowing seeds of doubt and mistrust throughout using the trusted educators. That's what happens in our schools now. Schools, kids go to school, they're given to schools for hours at a time, days at a time, and these kids come back with a whole different ideology. Parents have very little clue of what's going on even in schools and what's being taught these days. And it's not like the old days where you had reading, writing, arithmetic. Now you have things like transition closets in schools. When parents will drop their kids off, and let's say that the teacher says, well, we're going to have different gender roles. You get to go into the Superman closet, change into whatever you identify as, and when the day ends at school, we're going to transition you back so your parents will never know. We do that now. That happens in schools. Not all schools, but it's happening more and more. I would infiltrate the highest levels of government and the bureaucracy by compromising the leaders and their families, especially their children. I would offer them personal riches in exchange for their virtue. An easy sale. I would attack anyone relentlessly, unmercifully, who decided to speak truth and seek elected office. And if elected, I would plant any kind of evidence, false or otherwise, and outright lie and employ the heavy hand of government in a way to eliminate such a threat. I would undermine any leader who stood up against my agenda by co-opting those from among their own party, thereby destroying them from the inside out. I would repeatedly tell the people of a nation that one world is greater than any one nation, thereby making them envious for the greater power, so they would ignore and disregard the amazing nation that they live in. I would send emissaries and ambassadors who would promote eternal security, prosperity, if they would only bow and worship at the feet of a one-world government. Okay? So, We see that happen a fair amount these days. I would make controlled and manipulated communication using social media and making that the new normal for news and prevent real journalism scrutiny by anyone. I would use the higher institutes of learning to churn out journalists who shared my worldview and destroy any idea of impartiality for the manufactured and sewed, for the manufactured and sewing towards my agenda. I would attack it on multiple lines, fronts, and narratives so that the nation couldn't decipher my efforts. I would keep them focused on individual differences and battles to prevent them from seeing my overarching strategy. And finally, when their children are confused and their men deemed irrelevant, their educational system compliant, and their health dependent on the state, I would step back and allow the freedom-loving people to continue to chase the good life, not ever realizing that they were actually the ladder they thought they were actually climbing, they were descending into the bowels of hell and taking their nation along with them. So, we're being attacked from all over, folks. Our only protection that we've got is our critical thinking and our awareness of what's going on. So whether you want to accept it or not, this nation and many nations were built on men and women of faith who had unshakable virtue. They weren't perfect people, but they were certainly virtuous people who forged a way forward. And that's a lot different than what we're dealing with today. Okay, so I know there was a lot of stuff there we kind of walked through, a lot of different things that people would do. So what I'm going to do is we're going to unpack some of those concepts further, and we'll kind of look at them. And the goal wasn't to try to depress you and to put you into this, funk, but the goal is to kind of show you how the big picture kind of all works together and how all these pieces are coming at you in many different ways. So while they have us focused on mandates, or they have us focused on masks, or they have us focused on vaccines, the goal is that you're looking over here when all the stuff's happening over there. That's their constant goal. And when I hear people say, boy, I really wish I could go back to the way things were. Do we really? Do we want to go back to when we were all asleep? Is that really what we want to go back to? Because that's how we got here. So the goal isn't necessarily to go back to where we were. There will never be the normal that we once had. We can look towards something different. If we're constantly focused on the way things were and the normal that we had, we are going to, by looking at the past, constantly trip over the future. We're not going to see it. So we have to see what the future is, and we have to have our eyes firmly planted on what that new future can look like and what it should look like. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So, as I was saying, if you think about it, the area that is most under attack in culture right now is children. Children are the biggest group that's being focused on consistently. And we hear a lot about transgenderism. That's a big, big topic these days. It's everywhere. And if you kind of look at the stats and you kind of understand what the focus is, and if the goal is to erode the family, and family generally has been comprised of a man and a woman. And no, I'm not a doctor, but I can still figure that part out. So that's what it is. And ultimately, no matter where you stand on the faith equation or anything else, at the end of the day, these were what I believe created by God. God made man and woman. So if I can eliminate these two, I can effectively get rid of God. And at the same time, if this was what family was about, I can get rid of that, and I can replace it with government, because that's my goal. I need to displace all these things to give that more power. So that's what we're living in. Those are the times we're living in. One of the things of living in the West Coast, left coast, is that famous thing I always hear from people, that deep down, everybody's just a good person. We're all just good people. Now, I found it really amusing because a week ago, I say 2 weeks ago, I spoke at a thing Christian had. We were at the legislative buildings, and this was an audience who were all like-minded people. They were out because they didn't agree with the vaccine mandates and everything else. And I asked them that question. I said, deep down, are people generally all good people? Now, you would think an audience that just went through the last 2 years that there wouldn't be a hand that went up. But 3/4 of them almost put up their hands. I was amazed by that. To think that after the last 2 years, people would genuinely believe that still. So, I got to be thinking there's some disconnect when that still is the belief. Now, the worldview that I have, that where I come from, again, you don't have to ascribe to it, but it tells me that people are generally wicked. I'd be one of them. It's just how we're made. It's our human nature. And whenever I have a disagreement with somebody on that, I say, well, tell you what, take a 2-year-old and tell me, do you teach your 2-year-old to hit, kick, punch? Do you teach them to do that? No, it seems like they're pretty good at it on their own. It's innate. It's who we are. So if that's the case, we know that imperfect people are going to be pushing these sorts of things. But the goal is that if there is no God, then that eliminates this thing that we call truth. And we hear a lot now, it's about my truth, right? So there's really two kinds of truth. There's subjective, and there's objective truth. So objective truth would be gravity exists. Does gravity exist? Okay, so if I think I'm Superman or I can fly and I jump off a building, will it care? Will my subjective truth come into it? Just because I would like to think otherwise? So if I believe I'm a rabbit, is that going to be reality? We laugh, but we're living in a world where we've got a man who was 462nd place in men's swimming, who then went and became a woman, and now he holds the NCCA records, and he's in first place. So, that's reality, it shifts. So, with that whole transgenderism, and you think what happened in Florida with the push against Governor DeSantis and the Don't Say Gay bill and everything else, there was a 1 in 10,000 boys have gender dysphoria. There's a study, 1 in 10,000, out of which the better part of 80% plus, some would say upwards of 90 plus, grow out of it. This usually develops between the ages of 2 to 5. Okay? So, the push in Florida was to stop the implementation of talking about sexuality or anything else with kindergartners to grade 3. Kindergartners. Now, I don't know. I didn't realize at kindergarten that was a real big priority. But if you think about it, if this is where that dysphoria happens between this age group, kindergartners are usually how old? 5, yeah. So if they're confused, what's the best time? So if you go along, how many people here have heard of Yuval Noah Harari? Yeah, so he's a transhumanist, but one of the famous things he says is he says that humans are basically hackable animals. Okay? So in other words, you can hack them just like you could hack a computer or anything else. So if they're hackable, generally, what's the best time you'd want to hack them? Yeah. You would want to have them at this age. This is when they're most impressionable. Which is really funny because we live in a world now that if your 5-year-old tells you that he or she can fly, You would say, go. Yeah, I believe in you, son. Leap off the building. You can fly. Sure you can. But we're doing that with other things. So we go back to why the kids. Well, we know that if we can, like I was saying to you earlier, if you guys can control the kids, have the trust level greater with the institution, with government itself, where the parents are effectively canceled out for their backwards thinking, the state controls the kids are your future voting bloc, they're everything else. That's your goal. Old people in this room aren't very good to these guys. They don't really care. You're not going to be around forever to vote or pay tax or be able to be controlled. You need a new and upcoming group constantly coming through the ranks. You need that 15% that represents that voting bloc. Now, generally, the BCTF, for example, like a lot of teachers' union, and I know there's great teachers, so I'm not picking on every teacher equally by any stretch, but they're generally left of center. So the kinds of kids they're going to be raising are primarily going to be left of center type kids, and that's what they're going to be pushing throughout the whole. You got a better one? Just is he still here? He's okay. That's okay. We'll make it work. So that's kind of what would be happening, right? So as you can see, like corporations, like we woke up one day and we said, hey, how come all of our corporations changed? Well, how did Disney become so crazy? Well, Disney is a company that has a vast amount of shareholders, and some of the largest shareholders are these ETFs, exchange-traded funds, companies like BlackRock, Vanguard, who own a large majority share. So they have a bunch of, think of it like a mutual fund. You have all these people who give these companies money, and these companies have their own agendas. So the head of BlackRock is a fellow who's on side with the whole Great Reset. So his ideology is shared by that same ideology. So when he has his whole, we'll get that real quick. Yeah, would you? Thanks. Maybe it's the wrong side. I shouldn't have used it. Should we flip it around? We're going to flip it around. We have like a technical issue here. So hold on. Let's use the other side. Voila, we got it clean all at once. I'll just use the pen there, thanks. So you've got these large ETFs, these large companies who have what they call ESG. Okay? That's environmental, social governance. So companies are now to operate not on the premise of doing good business. Companies are to operate on the premise of what works for the environment, what is socially good. That determines good governance. So you've got these large ETFs, people who own large chunks of these companies. So for example, with BlackRock, I believe it's roughly 9 to 10% of Disney they own. So they simply would then say, hey, Disney, we don't like this policy you're doing. We'd like you to do this because this is way better for the environmental social governance we'd like to see. Now, the funny thing is this BlackRock, which is worth roughly, I believe the last count was $8 trillion in holdings. They started this new energy exchange. So that will allow companies to basically be able to regulate and trade through that sector. So basically what they've done is they've started a exchange which rewards companies on social governance, and they use governments and different organizations to push that social governance so they can make more money. Okay? A lot of reason that these big companies will get in bed with government. So for example, we'll just use Bill Gates. How many people here know that Bill Gates is huge into the vaccines? Record profits. He did an interview not too long ago. He said that out of his investments, The vaccines have been the best because they're giving him 20 times the return. They've been fabulous for him. But one of the things Bill Gates can't do is he cannot force every citizen to get vaccinated. But what he can do is he can get those unvirtuous elected politicians who are in government, because government has two powers. They have policing, and they've got the ability to pass laws. That's something a billionaire can't control. So no matter what Jeff Bezos would like to do, these are two things that he can't do. But he needs these guys to implement both. And through that process, he can achieve his goal. And we're seeing that play out all over. So places like, for example, in India, they have sued Bill Gates because they've had vaccines that he had pushed before where there's a lawsuit impending against him. And when India, for example, had Pfizer and them come along and say, hey, we're going to offer you vaccines, they said, well, we'll take it as long as you agree to be liable if anything goes wrong. And they said, no, we won't. So then they decided not to go with them. But in Canada and the US, we willy-nilly, we went along. Because again, there's a lot of money at play and a lot of movement throughout for these folks. And if we go back to it all, like I said, the goal is ultimately, it's all about power. You look at the whole Twitter battle with Elon. And now Elon there's some things about him that are good. There's some things that he believes in that are a little crazy. But at the end of the day, the one area that he is agreeable with most people in here is the idea that there should be an open place for people to speak. But what we have to be careful of is not to put so much faith in Elon that he becomes our new savior. Because Elon's just like any other person. He's infallible. He's not going to be perfect. He's going to do things that we disagree with. But the real fight at Twitter was the fact that one of the major shareholders in Twitter was BlackRock. That same BlackRock was number 4 in holdings in Twitter. The same BlackRock that was pushing ESG, and the same Twitter that last year implemented a new policy to capture misinformation about anybody who didn't agree with the green agenda. So, these guys owned a chunk of Twitter, which these guys believe in this ideology, the same Twitter that was going to take off anybody that disagreed with that ideology. Okay? So these things are very interconnected. Like I was saying earlier, you want to, when you're going to take over a nation, you're going to go at it at every level. You're going to go at it from the schools to the corporations to every entity that's there. You're going to go into the churches. You're going to go into every type of institution because that's your goal. You have to seed your people into all these places, people who share that ideology. So, how do you counter that? Well, the only other option is to get your people who go against that into those positions. And a lot of us have been checked out of that for a long time. We didn't participate. You know, we sat on the sidelines. I was just as guilty as anyone else. And we just watched life go by. We were like, hey, if these guys don't screw things up too bad, I'm okay. But these folks have been working at this now for 50, 60 years. They've had this agenda. It's nothing new. It's not like it happened overnight. The culture wars, all of this stuff has been happening for a long period of time. If you look at it, Andrew Breitbart had a saying. He said that politics is downstream of culture. And for a lot of people who, let's say, more are conservative-leaning or right of center, they checked out of culture a long time ago. We were basically took the approach that, hey, if it's not hurting anybody, you know what, whatever. And when we heard statements that weren't absolute truth anymore, we just walked away. Because we had that great old Canadian philosophy, which is we don't talk about the two things we never talk about in public are religion and politics. And those are the only two things that matter. All the other things are fairly irrelevant. I mean, they may be important to you, but they're not going to fundamentally be the building blocks of society. So now we're forced to play catch up for all those years. And there's a lot of people who've now gone through the last 2 years and said, again, I'd like to go back to normal. And like I said to you earlier, there's no going back. We wouldn't want to go back because we're going to be, the good thing that's come out of all of this last 2 years of madness is that at least now you see the playbook of the people you're up against. They're not hiding it. They're not pretending in any way. They're full frontal. And they're telling you exactly what they think of you and what they think of those who oppose them and everything else. And they're full on. So now we have a chance to see their playbook and start figuring out how and ways that we can look at trying to counter it. Okay? So anyway, I know we covered a lot of ground. There's a lot of stuff. So what we'll do is we'll just open it up to you guys in the floor, and so you can just questions, whatever thoughts you have, ideas, and I can bounce them off and we can go through them. Sure, yeah. 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 Yep. Well, what you got to do is write your senators, write everybody you can as far as pushing towards a no digital currency. That's what you've got to do. We've got to educate people on what happens when you do live in a digital currency. And the classic example of that would be the truckers in Ottawa. I mean, once you can control people's bank accounts and you can control anything else, you have power over it all. But what you're starting to see is parallel companies, economies, more conservative thinking companies coming alongside. So, for example, there is now a competition to Stripe, who's a payment processor. There's a conservative company who's come out who's doing exactly what Stripe's doing, but they're not going to cancel you. There's a new Visa company that's come out in the US that's strictly for like-minded people. So you're starting to see those sorts of things coming up. But what we have to do is think of it this way, and let's look at it this way. With all, and I'll cite back to the transgender stuff. 5% of the people agree with what's going on there. 95% of the people oppose it. Yet 95% of the people say nothing, and that's why the 5% are moving the needle. So if we're going to be like this, we have to be the vocal people who are actively engaging the politicians, the leaders, and everybody in any place that you can hear it, talking as many friends, people you can, to help them understand that what digital currency will do to them. They may be on the right side of the people in charge today, but tomorrow they could be on the opposite side of an issue. Actually, we could even just look at Shanghai and see how well all of that works out. Oops. Did I hit something? Okay. All right. So I get it. So, but we're only way to. I know. You see that? That happen? Is that? Is he? Okay. Would you? Okay. Sure. Yeah. So yeah. So the only way to do it, my friend, is just to educate more people, push back against it. I wish I had an easy answer for you as to the best way to cancel it. I don't. That's all I can think of, and that's all we've got. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, you can use cash. Yeah. 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 Well, I think the other thing you're seeing is, like, especially with the movement recently with Twitter, with Donald Trump's Truth Social, there is the folks that are right of center, conservatives, are starting to get on the field. We've just been off the field for a very long time. I think there's more of us than there are of them. I believe more people share this, and all of the craziness of the last 2 years has put on display for the people that were kind of wishy-washy, kind of the seriousness of what's been going on. But our biggest challenge is to get young people in here. That's our biggest challenge. So I would love to see 12, 13, 14-year-olds in here. That's a group we have to reach. because those kids are constantly being bombarded through social media in a whole different way more than most of us in here, because we don't spend the same amount of time. Okay, yeah.
So you're against kind of the digital bank account stuff. How do you feel about cryptocurrency?
Oh, how do I feel about cryptocurrency? Well, I think cryptocurrency in its freest form, just like the internet was supposed to be, would be great. However, what you're starting to see is government starting to step in and wanting to regulate it. It's happening in the US, it's happening in UK, it's happening in France, all these places. So the reality is, as soon as we encompass Big Brother into anything, it's a disaster. What we are doing is, as the citizen grows smaller, so let's think of this as this, and this is government. The smaller we get, the bigger government has to grow. Okay? And what we've done is, by disengaging from the marketplace, by not being participating in our democracy for the last umpteen amounts of years, we've allowed these people to have free reign. So now the challenge is, how do you seize it back? It's like you've got a 5-year-old who's addicted to having ice cream every day, and now you got to pull it back. It's not going to be easy. You're going to have a lot of kicking and screaming. Okay, yeah.
This is microphone, eh? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just a thought for what it's worth, and I appreciate your opinion on this. I think a lot of us either have been, if we, in the last several months, a number of months, if we come out in particular in the area of concern about the vaccines, et cetera,
Yeah.
we're immediately labeled as anti-vaxxers.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's maybe virtue in, if you will, shifting the focus away from that by saying, we're not talking about vaccines at this point in time. We're talking about control of our lives. We're talking about, social credits. We're talking about
absolutely.
Sort of things.
Yeah. Well, this is what I was saying to you: is the goal is to have you narrowly focused on one area. It's sort of like when we were doing meetings before, we were talking about early treatment and how we were saying that most people focused on masks, vaccines, social distancing, things like that. This is what people argued over constantly. So while they were arguing over that, it's sort of like, you go to one of those in Vegas and they have the cup game with all these 3 cups and they put a ball under one of them. And the little ball was early treatment, but nobody got to see where early treatment was. They kept moving it around all the time. All we kept doing with every neighbor was arguing about this stuff. This is no different. This is all flows to a bigger position. This is about control. Who's going to have control over your life, and how are they going to do it? The question is, will you control it, or will they control it? That's it. And we can have these minor skirmishes and get sidetracked and go down all these rabbit holes. But the real issue is this. If we spent enough time focused on the people that are running the show, they know we would discover how inept and useless they are, and we would boot their asses out. And that's the reason why they don't want you focused on that. Okay? Yeah. With the back there.
Hello, I just really liked how you said how there's 5% that are pushing this, and the 95 aren't doing anything. And it brought to mind a term that's used in political theory and psychology, but it's called the Overton window. Yeah. And it says, the Overton window is the range of policies politically acceptable to the mainstream population at a given time. It is also known as the window of discourse. And growing up, I saw in my youth, how they were pushing for gay rights and certain things, in 2008. And they'd always bring up stories, and they'd always make it super unthinkable and radical, this couple that was gay got married. So it was super unthinkable and radical. So how could we think of what topics that are super unthinkable and unradical can we bring up in the truth and in positive ways for our country?
Okay, so yeah, good question. So first off, don't hear me wrong. I have, again, the worldview I ascribe to says that I can love the sinner, I don't have to love the sin. So I have nothing against anybody who's struggling with transgenderism, that's gay or anything else. That's fine. I have no issue with them. I believe God created them the same as he created me. That part we're even on. The Overton window, there's been a lot of movement on it. And the latest push now in it is pedophilia. This is the big one now. So if you look at, there's professors out of California and Berkeley who are now, there was a professor who came out who said, it is unfair to label anyone a pedophile. That's a label that's just misguided. So really, if two people want to engage in something, you know, is it really harmful? And really by stigmatizing it, are we not making it really hard? So that slippery slope, that Overton window has changed so much in this whole discussion. And we know that the biggest way to get a nation off course, the biggest thing that drives them, that fuels most people, is lust, is sexual. Those are nations who've fallen apart due to those things. It's the things that divide nations and cause a lot of damage to nations. And again, I lived through a time way back when people who were homosexual basically said, look, I just want to be left alone to live my life. Okay, so people said, fair enough. Because the greatest thing about Canada, one of its greatest qualities, is its tolerance. And the challenge, though, is usually what your greatest quality is usually your greatest weakness. And that once you allow that tolerance, and because you were tolerant of somebody coming in, then they say, oh, okay, well then if I say anything now and you complain, it's intolerance. So they seize that moment. So we went from please let us be just left alone, live our lives, to can I just be with my partner, to can I have same-sex unions, to marriage, to now you have to celebrate me for a whole month and if not a whole year. And if you don't embrace it, something's wrong. So we have a problem when it comes to that. Okay? So the challenge is it keeps pushing because it's played on your humanity. I don't have anything against anybody if that's the way they want to, fair enough, that's the way they're choosing to live. I think there's obviously better ways to live. However, when I'm forced to not only accept that, but to celebrate it and to encourage it in society, that's when things start going awry. And so if we're going to push back against this pedophilia, when people say, oh, there's no chance of it happening, the good news now, the time we're living in, the people who believe in that are broadcasting it. They're not hiding it anymore. So if you Google a couple of those professors, you'll see their quotes. So the good thing you have to do with that is share with a friend or person and say, here's what they're thinking. What do you think? But again, I go back to Yuval Noah Harari. I go back to an atheistic worldview, a humanist worldview. If we are all just mere atoms, we're just a chance that we're here, and it was by random chance, it's by evolution. Well, evolution tells me that it's survival of the fittest. So what's wrong with if I take advantage of some kids? What's really wrong with that? So when you have people who go along that line, the challenge always is to get them to unpack what they believe. Most times, most people will espouse talking points. Most of them have never thought through what they're really arguing for. So your challenge is respectfully ask them, okay, and then what? Thomas Sowell, if any of you have heard of Thomas Sowell? Who here? Yeah. If you haven't, look him up. Great intellectual, economist, just brilliant man. And one of the things that he does and that he talks about a lot in his part of his investigating is, and you just have to go with the, and then what? Just keep asking those questions. Just next statement. If somebody says, okay, I believe in universal income guarantee for everybody. Okay, well, tell me how that's going to work. How will that unpack? Who will pay for it? Who deserves it? What's the amount? You have to start getting them to think critically. So if somebody is pushing for pedophilia or something and say, okay, at what age is it not acceptable? 1 year old? 2? What's the limit? You have to get them to do that because their challenge is they want to be seen as people who don't want to hurt somebody else. They want to be liked, but they also at the same time don't want to be offensive to someone. And that's our challenge. So we have to be speaking to that. Okay? But when we create everybody as either victims or oppressors, that's what we're left with. Okay? Does that answer your question?
My question was, how can we move the Overton window in a positive way?
Yeah.
In truth, like,
Yeah, okay.
I was thinking more like encouraging people to have families.
Yeah.
Or like for me, something I do is like, this is just one example, but it's like I say, I want to have 7 kids.
Yeah.
I don't actually want to have 7 kids right now. Like, I don't know what's going to happen, but it just makes people think like, oh,
No.
vivaciousness is good, life is good.
Yeah.
And it gets people away from what is currently
Okay.
being taught.
Okay. So the
What
way
are
to
some
do that
other
is to
positive
okay, so the way to do that would be to offer a better message. So what is the conservative message? What would somebody like myself say? Well, my message would be, I would say to you, give me an hour and we'll sit and we'll unpack what my Bible has to say about it and how the Word of God speaks to it and how that life will allow you to be more free than you thought you could be. So that's where I'd ask somebody to begin. Okay? And basically lay out the arguments for it and say, now you decide which argument seems to work better. Is this one destructive to society? Is this one positive to society? And that's the best place to begin. But the fact that you're actually thinking about those things is amazing. And you're willing to engage in that. Because a lot of people have checked out of that a long time ago because they're afraid of losing friends over it. If someone is not willing to listen or engage in dialogue, they haven't reached the point of any kind of maturity. They're children. People should be willing to do that. We should be able to disagree because iron sharpens iron. The better we are at it, the more our ideas will get refined. Okay. Anybody else? Question? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, they are. I mean, these companies, all the media companies primarily primarily all the large ones are owned by like 6 corporations and individuals. So we already know, like I said to you earlier, the goal would be you have to infiltrate all of these companies. So it's already been done. Okay, so we're already there. We know that this isn't real in that sense. But the good news again is, through the time we're living in, look at with what happened in Ottawa, how many independent journalists we had. So there is options. There's stuff happening. You can seek out that news. We have to make sure that people are not intellectually lazy. You have to challenge those people who just believe in the narrative, watch CBC all the time, and they take it for verbatim, and continuously offer them other venues and other stories. Now, they may rebuff them the first 2, 3, 4 times, so be it. Who cares? You cannot let up on it, though. Because our thing is, look, you know what? It's not worth it. I'm not saying argue with somebody pointlessly, but sending a quick email or a post and say, hey, let's check this out. And asking them to view it with you or challenge you on it as to what they're hearing. That's what we have to do. We have to critically engage them. And we haven't done that for so long. Because again, a lot of people involved in this also look at the headline of what somebody says. They don't always unpack it either. So we have to be educated in it. Just like he said, the Overton window. A lot of people don't even know what the Overton window is. So it's getting ourselves realizing that we're in a war of information, knowledge, and we want to be the people. So if you're having a disagreement with someone, I always find that you may not change the mind of the person you're disagreeing with, but whoever's overhearing your conversation, that's who you're speaking to, is that third party listening in. Okay, yeah.
I was wondering, for those of us who, well, there's very, very few people I know who are even receptive to listening to whatever I might have to say about it. But
Yeah.
every now and again, we do run into someone, and I'm wondering if it would be possible for this group to maybe once a month or once every 2 months put on an entry-level seminar that we could bring our friends or family to, that wouldn't scare them off, but just to sort of lead them very, very gently into understanding some of the events, maybe the World Economic Forum. There's people that I speak to on the left have never even heard of the WEF.
Sure.
And just some kind of an entry-level seminar that we would feel comfortable inviting people to.
I think the goal of these was that you could invite anybody.
Well,
So,
I've been assessing it to see if it would
Yeah.
to see if it would be safe for me to bring some of
Yeah.
my friends to, and I'm just not sure it would be. So, it's something very strategically, carefully planned.
Yeah. So I'd have two schools of thought on that. The challenge would be that if we have to try to figure out the delicacies of each individual as to what may offend one and what may not offend others, we're going to have a really hard time. And I don't mean in no disrespectful way. The challenge is that no matter who you bring in here, I guarantee you they're going to be offended. They're just going to have to be, because they have not heard any of this for so long or ever. And there's going to be that takeaway that some of the people will honestly, no matter what we say, no matter how much we try to convince them, they're not going to change from it. And some people, unfortunately, have to be jarred into the other side of it. So anything that we said, I don't think it's too controversial, but I appreciate what you're saying. The challenge in something like that might be, if you've got a set of friends, organize a small group, 5, 6, 7 people. If you want, I'll come and speak. You tell me what we should talk about. I'll be happy to help you. So that's something we can do. But in a large group, it's so hard to gauge each person and where they're at as to what would really work reasonably well. I hope that answers it. Okay, yeah.
Cam, I'm interested in your thoughts on a short-term solution for what's currently going on and a long-term vision and plan as well, because I'm convinced that if we don't come up with a short-term solution, we're never going to have an opportunity to implement a long-term vision and to be able to turn things around. And so with that, I also want to be able to make a statement as well as a couple of questions related to it as well. I would identify since 1840, what we've done within the context of our history is education has been a delivery system for ideologies. They've been conceived, propagated, and disseminated in the halls of university. So whether you study communism, Nazism, or the Frankfurt School and that particular ideology, they are conceived, propagated, and disseminated there, but then they seek to infiltrate the education system. And yes, the politics is downstream from education, without a doubt. Hitler said, whoever has the youth has the future. Mm-hmm. Whoever has education has the youth. Okay, thank you. So with that, whether you look at Stalin identified education as a weapon. Lenin said, give me one generation of youth and I'll transform the world. So I'm not necessarily identifying these labels as what we are facing, but what has happened is even in our education system in the US, out of millennials, 44% identify as socialist. In Canada, 68%. And so we have to be able to recognize what's going on in the context of our education systems at the top levels and the bottom levels, and we have to be a part of the solution or part of the vision long-term to be able to, again, be within those spheres.
Yeah.
But your thoughts on short-term solutions, long-term vision, I'm very interested to find out where you're coming from.
So I think the short-term solution is it has to go back to people's homes. You have to sit down with your own kids, your nephews, your nieces, your grandkids, whomever, and you've got to invest the time and start unpacking what's going on with them. That's the first place to begin, because we can reach out at the larger level. We can say, well, we want to change the electorate, and we could. We've got, for example, in the last federal election, there was roughly 39% of eligible voters didn't vote. So there's a large block of people who could be mobilized to do something in the next election. Now, people who are fundamentally left of center were activated, voted. There was a lot of people who are indifferent on the right who didn't spend a lot of time voting. So that's definitely a group in the short term. But I think our only hope is the family unit. That's it. If we can't save family, we can't save anything. That's where we have to begin. And we have to decide on what hill are we willing to die on. And for me, when I look at the hill, if we lose the definition of men and women, we're done. And I wonder where all the feminists are. Because feminists celebrated women. They were all about, woman, hear me roar. I'm so different. And I want women to be recognized. Well, if we wipe out what a woman is, what will it matter? All is lost. Because then all bets are off, because we have no objective truth left. Truth is what I say it is. So it begins in that home. It begins engaging your kids. It begins working with that younger generation, folks like those folks, younger, to understand what it is that we're promoting and why we think that this is a better ideology. And we have to do a better job of selling it, but we've left the spheres of it. You know, unfortunately, I would love to say that churches are engaged. They're not. A lot of churches are silent. They're not out presenting the alternative viewpoint to what culture is presenting. What's the difference? Is there do you have a better solution? Well, if so, unpack it for me. What does it look like? Don't tell me I have to accept it just because you say it is there, but intellectually be honest. And that's what we have to look at. So we've got a long way to go. I wish that's the only short-term thing I can offer you. It took 50, 60 years to get here. It might probably take a generation or two before we come out of it. That's where we're at. You're starting to see the push. There is people, and one of the good things that came out of the Elon Musk thing is it proves that one individual can still change the system. Now we could say, yes, he's a billionaire. I grant you all that. But it just proves he was also up against other billionaires. He was playing in the same sandbox. So that means that all of us as individuals, when we push against it, those little waves that we generate can make a difference as well. But the idea of the globalists is to encourage you to believe that you have no power. You're part of the collective. Nothing could be further from the truth. And that's, again, where my worldview holds it, that I'm created uniquely and I have innate worth and value. So if I can believe that first, I'm less likely to take all of the stuff lying down. And that's what we've got to do. We got to begin with reclaiming that education, but not relying on surrogates to do it, like teachers, but parents, uncles, aunts, grandparents. They have to get engaged. We don't have a choice. Yeah. Just over there.
Yeah, how do we protect our children
Well, I think the only way to protect your children,
from the indoctrination in the schools?
well, there's two schools, and obviously two schools of thought. One is obviously you can homeschool, which is not easy for everybody to do. For example, homeschooling rates have skyrocketed now, but not everybody has the luxury of doing that. So the other option that you can do is you can be engaged in the school. I would get to know the teacher you've got in that school. I would find out what they're teaching. I would look for any opportunity to volunteer in the school if you can. I know when my kids were little, we used to do part of the reading program. So we'd go to the school and help the kids all read. You've got to be willing to do those sorts of things. And I would say one of the things that we did all the time, every day is, and this is as silly and as stupid as it sounds, have a meal together. When you sit at a table, you're eating together with your kids and everything else, you're engaging in conversation. You're finding out what happened in their day, unpacking what they're learning in school. If we don't find out what they're being taught, how are you going to address it? That's it. It's just having to be more engaged. And I know with the stresses of time, and it's not easy, but this is what we got to do. Because we have turned over these kids to that system for so long, and they've essentially become a glorified babysitter who's now instilling their own virtues and values onto these children. And the only way you can counter that is to provide a alternative message that makes sense to these kids. And that hopefully is better than what culture is offering. And that's what you've got to do. Okay? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just reading a story out of Sweden, the world's first feminist government. Where's that? Here? Yeah. And so this girl in school, she was raped by the African, and the teacher would not report it because of being afraid of being a racist.
Yeah. No, I know. We've got a
Unbelievable.
yeah. We've got a lot of issues right now. So again, we come back to the not wanting to offend and people being silent, thinking that if they speak out, they're going to get canceled. Well, you know, the truth is, when you speak out, yes, it'll have a price. I'd love to tell you you're going to get out of this unscathed, but you're not. And we have to be willing to accept that. We have to be willing to throw our hat in the ring, take those punches, because they're going to come. What I'm saying is not popular. I get criticism. People say all kinds of things. C'est la vie. It's life. And we just have to, unfortunately, be willing to deal with that. And I know a lot of us don't like to do that because, again, we're nice Canadians. We don't want to offend. But the reason we're in this mess is because of that. That sometimes we have to be willing, not sometimes, we always have to be willing to stand for objective truth. You just have to. And it doesn't take a large majority to change things. Like 5-6% of the people, like in the US, they said that if you look at the rates, there's less than 1% of the population, actually way less than that even, are transgender. And yet this is the number one largest issue. You would think that everybody was. It's a small group can move things a fair amount if they're really loud. Yeah.
I still think that you should offer something here because a prophet is without honor in his own home.
Sure. Yeah.
I have a brother with the Communist Manifesto in his bookshelves and Karl Marx
Yeah.
with a sledgehammer on
Yeah.
the fridge, and I mean,
And where does he
There's-
live?
he just moved to Creston.
Why doesn't he move to the Soviet Union? Or sorry, Russia?
Actually, he's the biggest capitalist communist I've
I
ever
know.
known. 'Cause
Aren't they all?
He bought 15 acres so he can rent part of it out to farmers.
No. Tell him to
He was
open
in
that free
Bolshevik
for everybody.
Russia.
Yeah,
he'd
yeah, yeah.
have been slaughtered.
Yeah, I know.
But anyway, I was just going to say, there is a fellow who has a podcast. He's called Steve Turley, Dr. Steve
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone's
Yeah,
ever heard
I've
of him.
Yeah.
He's a history prof who left academia, and his analysis of the news is very insightful.
Yeah.
And he also offers different programs to cancel the woke culture. And anyway, if anybody wants to tune in,
No, I've listened to him before. He's good.
it's a good and a positive resource.
Yeah. I think the challenge, like I said, is the biggest thing that you can do is equip yourself so that you can be that person who is able to engage those friends of yours. Because by the time you get them to either tune into something else or find something else, it's always challenging. But if you can be equipped in that moment when it comes up, you're ready to go. And that's our challenge always. Or if like you've got a couple of good episodes with Turley's, put them on your phone, save them in your favorites. So when your friend's sitting there, say, hey, let's watch this together. Let's unpack it together. And if they have questions you can't answer, fine. Say, look, I'll come back to you on this. Let me think about it. Let's see how we can tackle it. Okay. Who else? Anybody? Yeah. Oh, sorry. He's going to put the mic. He's going to mic you.
You really raised some interesting points here, but the question I have on this in this particular area is there are a number of ways which I think we are being attacked by through the powers that be, if you will, that are trying to undermine us. Whether it's digital currency or social credit or whatever it might be. Are there particular topics or areas that you think we would be wisest to, question or deal with or act upon?
Well, I guess the thing about it is it comes down to where your interests lie. Like I said, for me, the biggest issue right now is basically the debate on men and women, because everything rests on that. Because if that gets lost, we're lost on everything. Because then all bets are off, right? Then basically, like I was saying, pedophilia is everything moves fast. And if we can't have objective truth and we can't agree on something fundamentally that's been known through thousands of years, and all of a sudden the intellectuals among us, the elites, can't figure that out, we got a real problem. Because then how are we ever going to agree on whether a mask works or not, or a vaccine's effective or not? Because we cannot agree on something that we can visually see and tell. I don't have to be a veterinarian to figure out what a male dog is and a female dog. I can tell the difference. And if I get to a point where I can't do that anymore, we got a real problem. Because then everything is open for interpretation. So that is a hill that has to happen, because if that goes, family falls. The family unit is redundant. And if that falls, then government will replace God, because there won't be any need for any. Because it will be that government hammer, the individuals who run it, who will tell you exactly what you're to think and believe. So you have to decide where you're going to dig in your heels. Yeah. Anybody besides Bruce in the back? He's like that guy in class you had that always put up his hand.
Give me your trajectory if we remain silent at this time in the battle for truth of what 2040 will look like.
Well, I don't think you have to go to 2040. Go to like 2023. Yeah. I mean, look at who would have ever thought. You remember when we originally had 2 weeks to flatten the curve? 2 weeks. How many people here thought that wouldn't last long at all? Show of hands. Who thought there'd be pushback? Yeah. And the amazing thing is that when we look around today, some of the people who are conforming the most still are young people. And back in the 60s, 50s, or whatever, the generation that rebelled were the young people. And now they're the greatest conformists. And the reason for that is we have instilled it into them in school. Conformity is a virtue. It's elevated. So we don't have that independent, and if you question anything, you are any one of those racist, supremacist, misogynist, whatever, you name it. And that's the state we're in. So what we have to do now is we have to be able to look at that, unpack the last 2 years and think about it critically. And it's a great opportunity, because if you think about it, a year ago, we couldn't have not really spoken to the net effects of the vaccines because they were so new. Now with Omicron, BA2, Delta, all these things, we have seen how they didn't prevent infections. Now you have a chance to have that discussion with people. But the challenge you're going to find is when you discuss that with people who've gotten vaccinated more than twice, 3 times, 4 times, whatever it is, 2 things a human being is always guilty of. One is pride, never admitting they were wrong. You're going to encounter that with people who did it. And number 2, you don't want to think about the consequences of what you put into you. You're like, you moved on. So the challenge now is, and that's your point earlier, I wouldn't be focused on that. I would draw them back, like we said. If culture is upstream of politics, what is upstream of the world we're living in right now with masking and all of that? That's that one world order. That is that global government, that ideology, which needs all of these other things to happen for it to take effect. There has been a bit of a pause or a slowdown in what these folks have been pushing. The next big thing they're going to push is going to definitely be the environment. And that will be our next one, where we're going to start restricting people on certain things. Even though we have huge fuel prices and everything else, April 1st, a new carbon tax started affecting gasoline everywhere, which nobody really paid much attention to. It was an additional cost on top of what we're doing. But again, we have energy independence. When we're not energy independent, we are dependent on other people. When we can have control over energy, we can decide how and when you have light or heat. We have control over your lives. So if I can control your health and I can control energy, I control everything about you. Yeah, well, food, but I need both. I need the energy to produce food. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was really weird because in the last month or so, there's been like about a dozen food processing plants that have accidentally gotten hit with planes and lit on fire and all kinds of things. So, you know, it's just a really coincidental kind of weird world these days that we live in. When Will Smith, when he hit Chris Rock, which was really funny because the Oscars was sponsored by Pfizer. Okay? And the joke that Chris Rock made was about alopecia, which is what Will Smith's wife has, which is a side effect of the vaccines. And so, ironically enough, the company that sponsored the Oscars, made the vaccine that has the side effect of alopecia, manages to create an incident where nothing but alopecia is talked about. And lo and behold, just a few months prior to that, they bought the company that was in third clinical testing of a new drug that, guess what, it treated? Alopecia. I know. It's a funny coincidental world. So, again, it's just paying attention to that. And then the thing is, when people say conspiracy theory, if you can have those things and say, okay, let's unpack this happening, would you think that it's reasonable that we could have a discussion around that there could be more here? And given the fact of the men-women debate right now, it's a great opportunity with people on the other side say, can you tell the difference between a man and a woman? And if somebody says, no, I can't, well, I think you're probably not better off arguing with them. You're wasting your time. Move on. When we were looking for, or when you're trying to elect someone for office, I have only one question I would ask anybody running for office. My first question would be, how many genders are there? If somebody running for office tells me there's more than two, and I don't have to be biblically based, they don't have to be religious, they just have to have common sense and science, then I know that they don't profess to have any. Because if there's more than two, it's news to me. That also tells me that they will go whichever way the wind goes, and they're not people of virtue or integrity. They'll vote whichever way the wind is blowing. So I can have someone who's purple and green. If they say to me that that's it, I'm going to have the next question for them. But that's my opening salvo. Okay?
I saw the federal application form for the passport.
Yeah.
Gender, male, female, other gender.
Yeah.
3 boxes.
Yeah, well, you know, it's okay. Facebook has, I believe, about 1,100 or something. So that's not, so you can come up with anything. Okay, anybody else? I know we're starting to, yeah. Christian, in the back.
Yeah, thank you. Question I have actually for everybody here, each individual, honestly, is would each, I see a lot of people, some elder, some younger, and I see this gentleman over here with the red shirt. He understands the importance of asking questions and, you know, making people think. And if we can encourage people to question what they're thinking and why, would each one of you consider running for school board? Because ultimately, you don't need any requirements.
Yep.
You need to have, in my mind, the right morals and a heart for the children and our future. And that's really where it's at. And that is this fall, right? So if I could ask each and every one of you, would you consider running for school elections? I think that is a real quick way
be a
to
great
start making
opportunity.
an impact. And the important part of that is you can start campaigning now. Start telling people, hey, I'm going to run for school board. Did you know this is going on in the school? I would stand for this, I would stand for that. And it's just an amazing, And everything you say to somebody transfers to somebody else in a conversation. It possibly goes to their children. You know, it's amazing the fruit that happens from one conversation, right? So
Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely. So, I mean, we have to engage at the smallest level, and you're seeing that happen, especially in the U.S. right now, where the school boards are where they're really going after heavily to try to replace a lot of this ideology, and they're putting other people in because mothers are realizing, wait a minute, that's not what I signed my kids up for. So we are that solution. So when you say to me short term, that would be a great short-term solution, to get involved in the political process, to effectively make those changes so you can shape the direction these schools are taking. Because like I said, those kids are the voting bloc, they're the future. And if we manage to, for lack of a better word, mess them up, not going to have much hope left. And as far as other elections, the other next thing would be to look at the people who are running provincially or federally. And being engaged in the political process is more than spending an hour to go vote every 4 years. It's being actively engaged. And don't be afraid to engage your MPs and your MLAs now. Send them emails, send them questions, keep inundating them. That's what they're there for. They're civil servants. They're not gods or demigods. They work for you and me. We pay their salary. But because we've paid little attention to what they're doing, it's sort of like kids in a kindergarten class. They've run amok. And now we're trying to rein them back in. But yeah, that's a great point. School boards would be a great place to begin. And you don't have to be, people always have this idea that, well, I have to be the smartest and I have to be this. Trust me, I've talked to a lot of politicians in the last year, and most of them are stupid. They're not brilliant people. They don't know much of the issues. I dealt with an MP who's in the riding in Victoria, and up until I talked to her, only the day before had she ever heard of ivermectin. She had never even knew what it was. So we somehow think that these are very informed people. They get a daily release. They get the dictate from the party or whatever is coming down. They read it. Those are their talking points, and that's it. Okay. Anybody else with anything else? Now we're going to have some snacks for you.
When is your next talk?
Oh, our next talk?
Well, your next talk.
Well, we're doing these, I think we were doing them on every Saturday until basically barbecue season. And then we were going to move them outside and barbecue. No, we weren't going to barbecue.
But
I was hoping to get a few more
You're
people.
back here in 2 weeks, correct?
Yep.
Okay.
I'll be here in 2 weeks. Yeah.
And then next week, I'll be speaking on critical race theory.
Correct.
Same place, same time. Here.
CRT. He likes to call it critical race theory. I like to call it critically rationally thinking. I think I'd rather rename it, but. Okay, so we're going to have some snacks in the back. Since we've subjected you to this, we'll feed you. Okay? Wow. That's about as excited as I get about snacks as well. Okay, thank you.